Section 1. The Legend That Never Faded. There is a name that echoes through 10,000 years of imperial history, like a note struck on a bell that no one has ever managed to silence. It does not belong to a living man. It was not spoken yesterday by the Lord Commander of the Imperium, nor was it carved fresh into the war memorials of some newly liberated world. It is far older than that, and somehow more alive than almost anything else in this dying galaxy. The name is Sanguinius, and the weight it carries is almost beyond calculation. In a setting defined by horror and hopelessness, where even victory tastes of ash and every triumph is merely a delay before the next catastrophe swallows it whole, Sanguinius stands apart from almost everything else the lore has ever produced. Not because he was the physically strongest, although the setting places him among the deadliest warriors the galaxy has ever seen. Not because he was the most celebrated strategist, though his campaigns during the Great Crusade stretched across dozens of worlds and left behind legends that even the cold administrators of the Administratum could not entirely reduce to dry logistics records. He stands apart for a simpler and more profound reason. In a universe almost entirely emptied of genuine goodness, Sanguinius was genuinely good, not performatively good, not strategically virtuous in the way politicians perform compassion when someone is watching. Not good because the alternative was worse. He was good the way a fire is warm inherently, completely, without calculation or condition. The quality of goodness radiated out of him the way light radiates from a source, not because someone decided it should, but because that is simply what the source does. That is why the story of his death still reverberates 10,000 years after it happened. That is why his sons still grieve him, with every heartbeat, why entire chapters of Space Marines have built their complete emotional and spiritual existence around the memory of a man they have never met and will never meet in the flesh. That is why, when people sit down to discuss the future direction of the Warhammer 40,000 narrative, its possibilities, its shapes, its unresolved tensions, Sanguinius is always hovering at the edge of the conversation. Not loudly, not with a schedule or a guarantee, but present, the way questions of great importance are always present, even when no one is asking them directly. The question of his return is not a new one. It has been asked in various forms since the lore was young enough to still feel fresh, and it has never been fully answered, because the answer matters too much to give carelessly. If Guilliman's return shifted the entire trajectory of the 41st millennium, then Sanguinius coming back would not simply shift it. It would break the current shape of the story apart and rebuild it from the foundations upward. It would change everything, not just for the Blood Angels and the roughly 24 successor chapters that trace their genetic heritage back to his gene seed, but for every major faction operating in the galaxy, for every narrative thread Games Workshop has been carefully weaving for decades, and for every person who has ever held a Blood Angels codex or cracked open a Horus Heresy novel and felt that particular ache that only the very best tragic stories produce. The ache of almost, of what should have been, of someone so clearly right for the world they inhabited that their loss feels not just sad but cosmically wrong. But before we can talk about what his return would mean for the galaxy, we have to sit with who he actually was. Not the myth. Not the golden statue on the side of 1,000 imperial churches built by believers who never saw him, and based their image of him on second-hand accounts, filtered through 10,000 years of ecclesiastical revision. Not the icon that the ecclesiarchy has assembled from the fragments of his story and painted over with the specific shades of theology they found useful. We need the actual person, the Primarch, the being who grew up on a dying moon, who knelt before broken warriors and asked to learn their names, who carried a terrible secret in his chest for years because he was terrified that honesty would get his sons killed, who saw the moment of his own death with absolute clarity and chose to walk toward it because the alternative was unacceptable. That's Sanguinius. The human one, or whatever the correct word is, for a being who is not human and yet more fully human than almost anything else the setting has ever put forward. What makes him so extraordinary as a figure in this particular fictional universe is precisely the contrast between what he was and what surrounded him. The 40K setting is not shy about its darkness. The Imperium of Man is a civilization built on cruelty and sustained by ignorance, where billions of people live and die in grinding misery in service of a god emperor who cannot even acknowledge their existence. The Space Marines, who are supposed to protect humanity, are monsters by any ordinary, standard transhuman killing machines, stripped of everything gentle during their creation, conditioned and implanted and biologically remade, until what is left looks like a person, but functions like something far more efficient and far less warm. The alien factions that circle the Imperium's collapsing edges are worse, in different ways. Into this universe, Sanguinius arrived with wings and a heart, and the heart was the unusual part. He felt things. He loved his sons not as abstractions, not as the legacy he was supposed to protect, not as instruments of the Emperor's will that he happened to be responsible for maintaining in functional condition. He loved them the way you love people you have spent years beside, people whose faces you know, whose quirks and strengths and failures are familiar to you in the intimate way that proximity creates. He carried them as a weight and a source of warmth simultaneously, which is the only way love actually works in any universe. He was troubled by the things that troubled them. He was proud of them in ways that were specific and observable rather than generic and performative. When he knelt before his newly found legion on Baal and asked them, one by one, to tell him their names, a legion that had survived catastrophe and was full of shame about what it had endured, waiting to be judged by the golden being that was supposed to be their Primarch. That moment was not a piece of political theater. It was what it looked like, someone who understood that the people in front of him mattered, individually and specifically, and wanted them to know it. That kind of attention is rare anywhere. In the 40K setting, it is almost unprecedented. The thing about Sanguinius that the myth sometimes obscures is how lonely a figure he was underneath all the gold and the wings and the love that surrounded him. He carried his secret about the flaw alone. He carried his visions of his own death alone. He moved through the brotherhood of Primarchs as a unifying force, a mediator, a source of warmth and stability for everyone else, and absorbed all of it without distributing the weight back outward. The people who are best at caring for others are often the worst at allowing others to care for them, because the habit of attentiveness to everyone around you leaves very little space to notice that your own needs exist. Sanguinius had all the warmth of the fire and all the aloneness of the thing that burns. That aloneness makes what is waiting for him on the other side of 10,000 years of absence particularly poignant if you think about it long enough. He comes back to a galaxy that has been shaped by his death in ways he did not design and could not have predicted. He comes back to sons who have been caring for his memory in his absence with a devotion that exceeds anything he asked of them. He comes back to a brotherhood of Primarchs that has been reduced and scattered and changed by the heresy and its aftermath, in ways that will require him to mourn, in ways he was never given time to mourn before. He comes back, in other words, to people who have something to give him rather than simply receiving everything from him. That might be the most important change of all. Not the cure for the Black Rage, or the military addition to the Imperial Order of Battle, or the political reorganization that his presence would trigger. The most important change might simply be that Sanguinius, who spent his whole life giving everything to everyone around him, finally gets to receive something back, finally gets to be the one who is welcomed home, cared for, held, allowed to be broken by what he experienced, without having to immediately put himself together for the sake of the people watching. He earned that. 10,000 years over, he earned it. So, when we talk about what his return would mean for the galaxy, for the Blood Angels and the Black Rage, for the Imperium and its politics, for the war against chaos, and the broader narrative of the 40K setting, keep that underneath everything. The galaxy-shaking implications are real and worth examining in careful detail, but they are all downstream from something smaller and more human than any of them. A father coming home to his children. A beloved thing found again after being lost. The simplest story in the most complicated universe, and the one that matters most. Let us go back to the beginning, to a radiation-soaked moon under an orange sky, to a baby with white wings, to the first moments of the being who would become the most beloved figure in 10,000 years of human history, and whose absence has been the loudest silence the galaxy has ever produced. If you are watching right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is where you are sitting, drop a comment below and tell me your location and the time. I want to know where in this galaxy you are listening from. And if you have not already subscribed, now is the moment. Every video here is made with this same care. Number, Section 2. The blood-soaked cradle Baal Secundus and the making of an angel. To understand Sanguinius properly, you have to start with the world that made him, and the world that made him was not kind. It was not designed for survival, and it offered nothing that resembled comfort. Baal Secundus, the second moon of the planet Baal, in what is now the Blood Angels' home system, was a place that had been destroyed by its own inhabitants long before any Primarch arrived there. Ancient wars, ancient weapons, ancient catastrophes had stripped the atmosphere of much of its breathability and left the surface soaked in radiation, intense enough to kill most living things through simple, prolonged exposure. A cracked red landscape under a permanently orange and poisoned sky where the wind carried things that could not be identified, and the dust that settled on your skin eventually worked its way into your cells and rewrote them wrong. The human population that still clung to life on Baal Secundus had survived through a combination of extraordinary resilience and the kind of adaptation that happens when natural selection has been running at full speed for centuries. They had organized themselves into tribes, because the fundamental requirements of survival on a hostile world create hierarchical social structures almost automatically. You need someone to make fast decisions, you need people willing to follow those decisions, and you need the whole group to move in the same direction quickly enough to outrun whatever is trying to kill you today. The tribes fought each other as often as they cooperated, competing for the limited resources that the devastated world still offered. They were, by many standards, living in a dark age of their own. Not the interstellar dark age of technology that looms so large in 40K history, but the smaller and more personal kind, the dark age of a people who have forgotten what they were and are not sure they want to remember. Into this specific, broken, precarious world, an infant fell from the sky with white wings. All the Primarchs landed somewhere during the process of their theft and dispersal by the forces of chaos, torn from their artificial gestation in the Emperor's laboratories beneath the Imperial Palace, and hurled into the void, delivered by the warp to worlds scattered across the galaxy, with a carelessness that was deliberate and malicious. Each landing was shaped by the world that received the Primarch and the circumstances into which he was dropped. Lorgar landed in a city of faith and became a believer. Angron landed on a world where slaves were forced to fight and die for entertainment, and emerged from that experience as something that could never fully stop fighting. Mortarion landed on a planet of pestilence and became its master. The worlds made them, or at least gave them the shapes that the forces of chaos had always intended they would take. Sanguinius's world was death in slow motion, and what it made of him was something that death could not entirely claim. The infant that fell on Baal Secundus already had wings. This is a detail that bears sitting with, because it tells you something important about what the Primarch program was actually building. The wings were not entirely normal. They were large enough, even on an infant, to be unmistakably significant. White feathers overlapping with a perfection that was more architectural than biological, proportioned in ways that suggested they were designed rather than evolved. On a world where mutation meant the radiation was getting to you, where physical abnormality was associated with the slow horror of contamination, sickness, and genetic collapse, wings should have read as a bad sign. Wings should have meant the tribespeople backed away. They did not back away. Something about this particular infant, with his particular wings, read differently than a mutation. The people who found him, the women of a tribe whose name and specific beliefs have not survived intact into the historical record, felt something when they looked at him. Something that the overstressed word holy gets used to describe, inadequately, because it is the closest word available for an experience that precedes and exceeds ordinary language. They took him in. They kept him. They raised him as part of the community that had found him, treating the wings not as a mark of corruption, but as something to be explained by the frameworks of meaning they had available, as a divine gift, as an answered prayer, as evidence that there was still something in the universe that wanted them to survive. They were right to feel that way, as it turned out, though the mechanism was less supernatural and more biological than their theology would have implied. Primarchs grow at a rate that makes regular human development look glacial. Within years, rather than decades, the infant that the tribeswomen of Baal Secundus had taken in had become something that could not be contained within any normal social category. He was taller than any man on the moon. He was stronger than any warrior the tribes had produced. His wings had grown with him, large enough now to carry him aloft, and the instinct that told him how to use them was as natural as breathing. He could think in ways that his teachers could not follow, could learn things they tried to teach him in fractions of the time it took anyone else, and could take that learning and apply it to situations his teachers had never considered. But what the accounts emphasize, across the various records that survive, is what he chose to do with that growing power. He did not dominate. He did not declare himself the natural leader of the people around him and set about reorganizing them to serve his own interests. Instead, he protected them. He hunted for food on a world where hunting was extraordinarily dangerous. The native fauna of Baal Secundus were adapted to the radiation environment in ways that made them genuinely lethal, and the expeditions into the deep desert that brought back the resources the tribe needed were genuinely risky, even for him. He defended the tribe against other tribes who came with violence. He learned the social structures of the community around him and worked within them rather than simply replacing them with his own judgment, because he understood even very young, even before he had the vocabulary for it, that the people he was protecting were not just problems to be solved or interests to be managed. They were people, with their own dignity and their own ways of being in the world, and those things deserved respect. By the time the Emperor of Mankind finally traced the warp signature of his lost son to Baal Secundus and arrived to claim him, Sanguinius had already done something remarkable, without anyone telling him to or even suggesting it was possible. The tribes of Baal Secundus, which had been fighting each other since anyone could remember, had unified, not conquered, not forced into compliance by a being who could have crushed all resistance without breaking a sweat. Unified through the patient work of a young Primarch who had decided that people being willing to kill each other over limited resources was a problem with a better solution than more killing. He had talked to them. He had listened to their grievances and their histories and their specific reasons for hating each other, and he had found the threads of common interest and common need that ran underneath all of it, and he had woven those threads into something that held. The Emperor is said to have shown Sanguinius a warmth upon meeting him that he displayed toward very few of his other sons. The reunion of Primarch and Emperor was different with Sanguinius than it was with almost any other of his sons. Where many reunions involved a degree of formal negotiation, the establishment of authority and reciprocal obligation, the working out of the terms of the relationship, Sanguinius is described as having simply knelt when he saw the Emperor. He recognized his father. He did not require convincing. And the Emperor, in return, is described as having shown something that the accounts reach for with words like warmth and pride, and something that, in a lesser being, might have been called love, but which the Emperor's translators consistently hedged with. Qualifications about the nature of a being beyond ordinary emotional categories. The terms of Sanguinius's agreement to join the Great Crusade included specific provisions for the people of Baal Secundus, guarantees of their care and status, conditions that protected the tribe that had protected him. He came to the table with conditions on behalf of other people before he negotiated anything for himself. The pattern of his whole life was already present in that first formal act. Care for others first, personal interests after, and a willingness to use whatever leverage he had in service of the people who could not advocate for themselves. There is one more dimension of Baal Secundus that deserves attention, because it is the dimension that will shadow everything else, the flaw, the red thirst. The genetic inheritance that Sanguinius discovered in himself and in his sons, that he spent years trying to cure in secret, that he ultimately could not fix, and that became the curse the Blood Angels carry to this day. The origin of the red thirst is debated in the lore. Some theories blame it on the radiation of Baal Secundus, working on the Primarch's biology during his formative years. Others trace it to something in the original gene seed design that went wrong when the Chaos powers scattered the Primarchs. And still others suggest it was deliberately introduced as a vulnerability by forces that wanted the Blood Angels weakened. Whatever its origin, its presence was real and its consequences were enormous, and Sanguinius knew about it from early enough in his Primarchhood that the decision to conceal it defined the character of everything that followed. He kept the secret. He protected his sons by keeping it, and in keeping it, He carried an isolation that no one around him fully understood, because the loneliness of having information you cannot share is its own specific form of suffering, different from all the other forms, and in some ways harder to address. But it was also, in its way, typical of him. He carried what he had to carry so that the people he loved could carry a little less. Number. Section 3. Wings of Gold, the Great Crusade, and the Brotherhood of Primarchs. The Great Crusade was the defining event of an age that the 41st millennium has almost completely forgotten how to mourn properly. It was the Emperor's grand project, the attempt to bind all the scattered human worlds of the galaxy into a single, unified civilization, powerful enough to survive in a universe that genuinely and actively wanted humanity. Dead, thousands of worlds to be reached, hundreds of campaigns to be fought, decades of sustained military operation across the breadth of the Milky Way, organized under the banner of a species, finally taking its place as something more than prey. At the head of all of it, carrying the title of War Master and the associated authority over the entire military apparatus of the Imperium, stood Horus Lupercal, Primarch of the Sons of Horus, the Emperor's most beloved and most trusted son. And at Horus's right hand, closer to the War Master than almost any other Primarch, present in the councils and campaigns that shaped the Crusade's direction, stood Sanguinius. The friendship between Horus and Sanguinius is one of the most important relationships in the entire Horus heresy narrative, and it requires careful handling because the comfortable version of this relationship, where Horus was always dark and Sanguinius was always the light, standing in opposition to him, is not what the early years actually looked like. Before the corruption, before Davin, before the decisions that could not be undone, and the wound that became a gateway to something that should never have been let in. Before all of that, Horus and Sanguinius were genuinely close. Closer, the lore consistently tells us, than any other pair of Primarchs. The affection was real. The mutual respect was genuine. The ease between them two beings of extraordinary capability, who somehow managed to operate together without the friction and competition that characterized most inter-Primarch relationships, was not performed for political purposes. It was actual. There is a small detail in the lore that carries an enormous amount of weight if you let yourself sit with it properly. It was Sanguinius who convinced Horus to accept the renaming of his legion from the Luna Wolves to the Sons of Horus. The change of a legion's name is not a trivial thing. It is an act of identity, a statement about what the legion is and what it represents and what it chooses to be called in the record of history. That Horus deferred to Sanguinius's judgment on this question tells you something real about how Horus regarded the angel. He listened. He took the view seriously. He trusted it in a way he did not trust most views. More remarkable still, when Horus was wounded on Davin in circumstances that should have been fatal, in the grip of something that looked like imminent death from a wound that no ordinary medicine could treat, he pointed towards Sanguinius as his potential successor to the War Mastership. The War Master of the Imperium, looking at his own possible ending, thought about who should carry what he was carrying, and the name he reached for was Sanguinius. Not Dorn, whose martial capability was arguably more straightforward and whose loyalty was absolute. Not Guilliman, whose administrative genius made him the obvious candidate on paper. Sanguinius. Because the being who truly knew Horus saw, in the angel, someone so obviously fitted for the role of leading this enterprise that the question answered itself without requiring analysis. What does that tell us about Sanguinius's capabilities? It tells us he was not simply a warrior with wings and a great deal of personal warmth. He was a leader in the fullest sense, not just someone who could fight at the front and inspire by example, but someone who could hold the complicated, contested, multi-faction structure of the Imperium's military together through the specific kind of authority that comes from being trusted rather than simply obeyed. Sanguinius was trusted. Across the breadth of the Primarch Brotherhood, across the range of legions, and their complicated political relationships with each other, Sanguinius occupied a position of credibility that was almost unique. People who disagreed about most things tended to agree about him. During the Great Crusade itself, the Blood Angels were extraordinary as a fighting force, and the way they fought reflected everything about what Sanguinius valued. They were assault specialists, rapid, fluid, kinetic, preferring close quarters to artillery range, entering combat from above in drop operations that gave them the initiative and used the chaos of close quarters fighting as an advantage rather than something to be avoided. They hit hard, they hit fast, and they hit from directions that conventional military planners did not expect. Sanguinius himself was the ultimate expression of this approach. Airborne, fast, moving through battle with a grace that observers consistently described as inhuman, which it technically was, and yet somehow specifically beautiful in its precision. The golden armor. The blazing wings spread wide as he descended on an enemy position, the blade moving at speeds that made it look like a continuous line of light rather than a single weapon. Remembrancers who accompanied the Great Crusade and tried to record what they saw consistently struggled with Sanguinius in battle, because the visual experience of watching him fight did not translate easily into the words and images that were their tools. What they mostly settled for was variations on the same descriptor. He looked like what people meant when they said angel, not the specific religious concept, which the secular Great Crusade officially disapproved of, but the underlying thing, the concept, was pointing at a being of great power, moving through violence with an ease that made the violence look like something other than what it was. But battles and visual impressions are not the whole story of the Great Crusade years. The other dimension of Sanguinius's importance during this period was diplomatic and social, and in some ways it was more significant than anything he did with a blade. Among the 18 Primarchs who took part in the Great Crusade, the dynamic of their relationships with each other was consistently fraught. These were beings of supreme ego and supreme capability, each shaped by a radically different childhood on a radically different world, each carrying a distinct set of values and priorities, and ways of understanding what the Imperium was supposed to be and what they were supposed to be within it. The friction between them was nearly constant and occasionally escalated into conflicts that required the Emperor's direct intervention. Leman Russ and Magnus the Red came close to open warfare on more than one occasion. The philosophical divide between the legions that favored the imperial truth, the secular, reason-based ideology the Emperor officially promoted, and those that privately maintained religious or superstitious frameworks, created ongoing tension that never fully resolved. The competitive drive to accumulate conquest records and honorifics produced jealousies and resentments that the Primarchs, for all their superhuman intelligence, could not entirely rise above. Sanguinius moved through all of this with something that looked effortless from the outside, and almost certainly was not. He had genuine friendships across the Primarch Brotherhood. With Magnus the Red, the brilliant and deeply controversial Primarch of the Thousand Sons, Sanguinius maintained a relationship built on mutual respect for each other's intelligence, a willingness to engage with Magnus's ideas rather than simply recoiling from the fear of what they represented. With the Primarch of the White Scars, Jagatai Khan, he shared something that the records suggest was genuine affection, two beings who valued movement and speed and the joy of the wind in a way that their brothers, who preferred fortification and artillery, never quite understood. With Rogel Dorn, the relationship was more complicated. Dorn's absolutism and Sanguinius's warmth were not always easy companions, but there was respect there too, the respect of two beings who recognized in each other a genuine commitment to something larger than personal ambition. Even with the Primarchs who were later revealed as traitors, Sanguinius maintained connections longer than almost anyone else. Not naively, he was not blind to the shifts happening around him, the darkness gathering at the edges of certain personalities, the changes in how certain brothers spoke about the Imperium and their place within it. But he believed, perhaps longer than the evidence warranted, that people could be reached, that honesty and presence and the willingness to actually talk to someone about what they were feeling could do what force could not. Sometimes he was right about that. Sometimes he was not. The Great Crusade produced enormous quantities of heroism and accomplishment, and Sanguinius's contributions to both the military and social dimensions of that period were enormous. But it also produced, in the quiet background of all those victories, the conditions that would eventually become the Horus Heresy. The resentments and corruptions and grievances that chaos had been cultivating were growing. The Emperor's withdrawal from direct involvement in military campaigns, his increasing focus on the secret project in the dungeons under the Imperial Palace, the webway gate he was constructing and could not discuss, created a vacuum of personal attention that the Primarchs, who had been given to expect direct guidance from their father, filled in various ways, not all of them healthy. Sanguinius felt the temperature changing. He noticed when brothers who had been open became guarded, when enthusiasm became cynicism, when the language people used about the emperor began to shift from reverence to something more complicated. He carried those observations, and the growing dread that accompanied them, largely in the same silence he carried everything else. Because the other thing happening to Sanguinius during these years was the deepening of the visions. The prophetic flashes that he had been experiencing since early in his life were becoming more specific, more insistent, and more terrifying. What he saw was his own death, his face, his wings, his hands reaching for something that kept slipping away. And above him, illuminated by the fires of a ship that was not supposed to be burning, the corrupted eyes of someone he had loved. He knew, before the heresy formally began, before the first shots were fired, before the galaxy knew what Horus had become or what the betrayal would cost, Sanguinius knew that the story was going to end in a specific way, in a specific place, and that he would be there for it whether he chose to be or not. The choice he faced, not the choice of whether to be there, but the choice of what to do with the knowledge of what was coming, is the defining moral moment of his life. He could have used the foreknowledge differently. He could have tried to warn the emperor more urgently, or tried to reach Horus before the corruption was complete, or tried to find a path that redirected the trajectory of events toward an outcome that did not require his death. He tried some of these things. He failed at them the way you fail at things that have already been decided in the structure of the universe by forces larger than any individual intention. And in the end, he accepted what he could not change and walked toward it with his eyes open, and made of the walk something that his sons have been trying to live up to for 10,000 years. Number. Section 4. The Red Thirst and the Hidden Shame. The secret Sanguinius carried through the Great Crusade was not a small thing. It was a live coal pressed against the chest in the dark, burning quietly, known only to the person bearing it, invisible to everyone else from the outside. The red thirst was not an abstract theological concept or a metaphorical weakness of character. It was a genuine biological reality running through the gene seed of the blood angels, a craving that emerged in conditions of violence and blood, embedded in the deepest layers of what his sons were, and could not simply be trained or prayed away. The gene seed of the Adeptus Astartes is the foundational substance of the Space Marine creation process, the biological key that activates the implanted organs and physiological modifications that transform an ordinary human youth into a transhuman warrior. Every chapter of Space Marines uses gene seed derived from the Primarch who founded their legion, and every chapter's gene seed carries the biological legacy of that Primarch in ways both intended and unintended. For the Blood Angels and all the chapters descended from them, that legacy carried something extra, something that had not been accounted for in the original design, something that had its roots in the irradiated moon, where Sanguinius had spent his formative years, and the specific biological pressures that environment created. In combat, particularly in the close, blood-thick chaos of melee engagement, where the physical reality of violence was immediate and overwhelming, Blood Angels were at risk of losing something that was not their courage, or their discipline, or their tactical awareness. Those things held. What could slip was a different kind of control entirely, a control over something older and more animal than any of the civilized layers that Space Marine conditioning built on top of a human foundation. The hunger would rise. The rational warrior receded, and what moved forward in his place had an appetite that military doctrine had no clean language for, a thirst that was specific in its object, in a way that was genuinely troubling to anyone who understood what Space Marines were supposed to represent. Sanguinius had discovered this relatively early in his tenure as the Blood Angels Primarch, when he began to notice patterns in his warriors that did not fit the profile of standard post-combat psychological response. The eyes, the breathing changes, the way certain warriors in the deepest moments of a close-quarters engagement began to move differently, to respond to different stimuli than normal tactical combat should have been producing. He investigated quietly. He spoke to his most trusted apothecaries in terms designed to minimize the spread of the information. He set research programs in motion that were framed as standard gene seed optimization work, but were actually specifically aimed at finding the mechanism behind what he was seeing. Nothing worked. Every investigation identified the presence of the flaw without finding a lever that could address it. Every proposed solution either failed outright or produced complications that made the underlying problem worse. The red thirst was woven into the Blood Angel's biology at a level so fundamental that extracting it would be like trying to extract a river from the landscape it flows through. You could not separate it from what it was part of. So Sanguinius did the thing that he did not want to do and had no good alternative to. He kept the secret, and he waited, and he hoped that time would produce a solution before the secret became unsustainable. His reasoning was not self-interested. The historical precedent that terrified him was specific and concrete. During the Great Crusade, 2 entire Space Marine legions had been deleted from the record, the 2nd and 11th, whose names and histories were subsequently expunged in what became known only as the Forgotten Legions. The details of what happened to them are not part of standard Imperial history, and the erasure itself is one of the more disturbing facts in the setting's background, suggesting that the Emperor was willing to eliminate entire legions when they were deemed problematic enough. Sanguinius could not know for certain that the Red Thirst would qualify as problematic enough, but he could not be certain it would not, and the risk was too catastrophic to court. He carried it. All through the Great Crusade, all through the growing darkness of the years leading toward the heresy. He carried it in the same way he carried everything else that was wrong about his situation, quietly, privately, without allowing the weight to translate into the kind of behavior that would have told the people around him something was wrong. The event that brought the flaw to a genuine crisis point was the Cygnus campaign. This was the crucible that reshaped the Blood Angels and burned away whatever innocence they had managed to maintain about what their bloodline carried. Horus, already corrupted and already planning the betrayal that would tear the Imperium apart, sent the Blood Angels to the Cygnus cluster. The mission was framed as a response to a distress signal, as an operation that would take them away from Terra and the siege that Horus was already planning in broad strokes. What the Blood Angels found at Cygnus was not the Imperial operation they had been told to expect. They found an entire system that had been given over to the powers of chaos, multiple worlds saturated with demonic energy, populations consumed or corrupted, and at the center of it all, Kabanda, a bloodthirster of Khorne, of ancient power and specific, personal malice toward Sanguinius and his sons. The Bloodthirster's assault on the Blood Angels was not primarily physical, though the physical combat was brutal enough. What Kabanda did that caused permanent damage was psychic in nature. He reached into the Blood Angels' collective consciousness and amplified the Red Thirst to a level that their training and willpower could not contain. He took the quiet background craving that every Blood Angel managed through discipline and turned it into a roaring, overwhelming wave that crashed over thousands of warriors simultaneously, stripping away the careful controls they had built around their hunger and leaving something animal and frenzied in its place. The Blood Angels went into a mass berserk state on Cygnus Prime. It looked from the outside like exactly the kind of genetic corruption that Sanguinius had always feared would lead to the Legion's destruction. The secret was, in that moment, functionally exposed not to the broader Imperium, but to every Blood Angel who experienced it, to Sanguinius himself, watching the thing he had hidden for so long run unconstrained through his sons. The humiliation of it and the terror were things the Primarch absorbed in silence and continued to absorb as he fought Kabanda in personal combat and eventually drove the greater daemon away, wounded to a degree that would have killed a lesser being. He recovered from his physical wounds in days. The psychic and emotional ones did not heal as cleanly. What Cygnus Prime also planted in the deep psychic soil of the Blood Angels' gene line were the preconditions for something worse than the Red Thirst. The connection between Sanguinius's psychic essence and his sons had always run deep. This is the nature of the Primarch-Legion relationship, which is biological but also extends into the warp in ways that the Mechanicum has never fully mapped. Kabanda's assault had stressed that connection to its limits, had made it vibrate at a frequency it had never been asked to sustain before. The resonance that would eventually allow the psychic shockwave of Sanguinius's death to reach every Blood Angel alive and everyone yet to be born that resonance was already present, already tuned by what happened on Cygnus. The Bloodthirster may not have known exactly what he was setting up. The Chaos Gods work on timescales that make strategic accident and deliberate foresight nearly indistinguishable from each other. In the aftermath of Cygnus Prime, Sanguinius knew two things with absolute certainty. The first was that the flaw in his bloodline was larger and more dangerous than even his most pessimistic assessments had suggested. The second was that he was going to die, and soon, and in a specific way that he had already seen in the visions that had been accompanying his life for years. He told neither of these things to anyone who did not absolutely need to know. He continued to lead. He continued to love his sons. He continued to fight. The encounter with Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, is worth dwelling on briefly because it represents one of the most philosophically honest conversations in Horus Heresy lore. Kurz, who had his own prophetic vision, his own relationship with seeing the future in ways that offered no comfort, confronted Sanguinius and essentially asked him, "You know how this ends, and you know the Emperor's teachings have not prevented it. Why do you still follow him?" The question was not asked in good faith in the sense of seeking genuine dialogue. Kurz was a being who had been broken by what he saw, and his questions tended to be attempts to break others similarly. But Sanguinius answered it honestly anyway, because dishonesty about something that important was not in his character. He answered with his choice, not with theology or justification or an argument that what he believed was correct, with the specific decision he was making, knowingly, in full possession of the information Kurz was wielding. He was going to die at Horus's hands. He knew it. He was going anyway. Not because he had found a reason the inevitable was not inevitable, but because the alternative, abandoning his father and the civilization they had been building together, abandoning his sons, abandoning the human race to whatever came next, was worse than dying. Not abstractly worse. Personally, specifically, in his own bones, worse. That is the most complete expression of who Sanguinius was. Not the wings, or the warmth, or the diplomatic genius, or the combat capability. The ability to look at a bad option and a worse option and choose the bad one deliberately with full knowledge of the cost, because the thing you are protecting is worth more than the thing you are paying. He walked toward Terra. He walked toward Horus. He walked toward the moment he had been dreaming about for years. Number. Section 5. The Siege of Terra. An Angel's Final Hours. The Siege of Terra was the catastrophe that defined everything that came after it. Everything in the 41st millennium, the Golden Throne, the Astronomicon, the Inquisition, the chapters of Space Marines, the structure of the Adeptus. The shape of the Imperial faith is downstream from what happened in the weeks and months when Horus's traitor legions surrounded the Emperor's palace and attempted to end not just a civilization, but the particular vision of what humanity was supposed to become. The siege is the wound that never healed, because the being capable of healing it has been on a golden chair, sustaining the psychic infrastructure of the Imperium with the last of what he has to give, rather than directing any of that toward recovery. The Blood Angels arrived at Terra, having earned their place in the defense at enormous cost. The Ruin Storm, the galaxy-scale warp catastrophe that Erebus of the Wordbearers engineered to prevent the loyal legions from reuniting with the Emperor, should have kept them away. It was designed to be an impassable barrier, a wall of warp energy so dense and active that no ship could navigate through it. The Blood Angels found a way through anyway, following the psychic beacon of the Pharos, a device of Xenos origin on the world of Sotha, whose signal could punch through the interference, and arrived in the Sol system battered, depleted, carrying months of desperate fighting in their bones, and ready to give everything that remained. The routing through Macragge, the encounter with Gilliman and Lionel Johnson, the establishment of the contingency empire, Imperium Secundus, in the depths of the Ruin Storm, all of this is part of a longer and more complicated journey than the simple narrative of the Blood Angels rushing home allows for. Sanguinius was named Emperor Regent of Imperium Secundus, a title that sat on him badly, that he accepted reluctantly and wore as a weight rather than a distinction, because the throne he was being asked to sit in was one he had never wanted, and that belonged to someone else. He governed Imperium Secundus as well as anyone could have governed it, under the circumstances, and then set it aside the moment the way home opened. On Terra, Sanguinius took his place at the defense of the imperial palace and fought with everything he had. The accounts of those final days are fragmented and sometimes contradictory, layered over with decades and centuries of religious interpretation that has made the historical core difficult to cleanly separate from the mythological accretion. But certain moments are consistent across enough accounts to be treated as reliably documented. The most famous is the defense of the Eternity Gate. The Eternity Gate was the final significant threshold between the traitor forces and the inner sanctum of the imperial palace, the last door before the emperor himself, the ultimate barrier that, if breached, would mean the siege was effectively over. The outer defenses had been overrun. The traitor forces were pressing in from multiple directions, and the defenders had been reduced to a fraction of their original strength through weeks of continuous combat without adequate resupply or reinforcement. The situation was, by any military assessment that was not deliberately optimistic, approaching total failure. Sanguinius stood at the Eternity Gate, alone, when the crisis was at its absolute worst. Wings spread wide, armor already bearing the evidence of days of continuous fighting, blade blazing with the energy field that made it capable of cutting through nearly anything the traitor forces could put in front of it. He held the line, not in the metaphorical sense of maintaining some position on a map, but in the literal, physical, personal sense of a single being, placing himself between an incoming tide of enemies and the thing they were trying to reach and refusing to move. He broke charges. He held positions. He fought Kabanda again, the bloodthirster of Khorne, who had tormented his legion at Cygnus Prime, who had supercharged the Red Thirst and planted the seeds of what would become the Black Rage, who had personal reasons to want Sanguinius specifically, and had apparently been given permission or opportunity to pursue that specific desire at the siege. The confrontation between them was devastating in scope. Sanguinius broke the daemon's back over his knee. This is not a metaphor in the lore. He physically seized a greater daemon of Khorne by the ankle and the arm and snapped it like a dry branch. The way you snap something that is in the wrong shape and needs to be put right. Then he kept fighting, because the enemies behind Kabanda did not stop when their champion fell. That image, the angel at the Eternity Gate, wings spread, sword bright, holding the end of the world at arm's length through the sheer refusal to stop, is one of the most iconic in the entire setting. It has been rendered in painting, in sculpture, in stained glass, in carved reliefs on the walls of cathedrals on thousands of worlds by artists working from descriptions of people who were not there, who had heard from people who were not there, who had read accounts written by people who might have been there, but might also have been constructing something that combined memory with the needs of a narrative looking for a symbol. It does not matter. The image is true, whether or not every specific detail is accurate, because it captures something essential about who this person was and what he chose to do with the time and the circumstances he was given. Then, Horus made his move. The War Master lowered the void shields of his flagship, the Gloriana-class battleship Vengeful Spirit. The shields going down was detected immediately by the Loyalist forces in orbit. The Emperor saw the opening and chose it. The strike force teleported. The Emperor, Custodian Guard, Sanguinius, Rogel Dorn, companies of Blood Angels and Imperial Fists veterans, into a ship that had become something more and worse than a military vessel, a floating temple to chaos, its corridors reshaped by warp energy, its crew transformed by proximity to the Chaos God's power, its spatial geometry altered in ways that made navigation inside it actively hazardous. The teleportation itself was disrupted by the ambient warp energy, scattering the strike force throughout the ship rather than depositing them together in a coordinated assault team. Sanguinius reached the bridge first. He was alone when he came face to face with Horus Lupercal. The accounts of what happened in the moments before they fought vary in their details, though several consistent elements appear across the most reliable sources. Some accounts suggest that Horus made a final offer in those moments, appealing to the memory of what they had been to each other, offering Sanguinius a place beside him in the new order he was creating, telling the angel that he did not have to die here. This is consistent with several aspects of Horus's documented behavior throughout the heresy, the selective preservation of relationships he had valued, the unwillingness to entirely abandon the person he had been, even as the corruption reshaped everything around that person. Whether the offer was genuine or tactical or a mixture of both, that the corrupted Horus could no longer fully disentangle, the result was the same. Sanguinius refused. He had already seen, in the visions that had been haunting him for years, what Horus's new order looked like in practice. He had been to Cygnus Prime. He had watched worlds burn. He had held the Eternity Gate against the evidence of what the new order actually was when you stripped away the rhetoric and looked at the ruins it left behind. There was nothing in that offer worth taking. There was nothing in any universe Horus was capable of building that was worth the price of agreeing to help build it. They fought. Sanguinius, already carrying days of continuous combat, already wounded in ways that would have been fatal to any ordinary being, exhausted in ways that went beyond the physical into something deeper and harder to name, threw himself at the most powerful version of Horus Lupercal that had ever existed, a being charged with the active power of all four Chaos gods, simultaneously, armored by their protection, burning with a corrupted purpose that made him something beyond the already extraordinary Primarch he had been before Davin. The power differential was enormous and obvious. The outcome, by rational assessment, was predetermined, and yet Sanguinius found something. In the last moments of the fight, in the final exchange of blows before Horus broke him, he found a gap, a crack in the armor of the most protected being in the galaxy, a vulnerability that should not have been there, that required the specific combination of his knowledge of Horus's physical form from years of brotherhood and his own desperate, dying clarity about exactly where to strike. He drove something into the crack. The wound was small. In any other context, against any other being, it would have been a minor inconvenience. Against a being empowered by the full complement of Chaos divine protection, creating any wound at all was extraordinary. The Emperor arrived minutes later. The wound Sanguinius had made was still there. And when the Emperor and Horus collided in the final confrontation that ended the heresy, the Emperor drove everything through the gap that his most beloved fallen son had made in those last seconds. The trade was this: Sanguinius's life for the crack in the armor, the crack in the armor for the Emperor's victory. The Emperor's victory for the survival of humanity as a concept, however battered and compromised, the specific civilization that survival produced turned out to be. Rogel Dorn found them both on the bridge when he finally made his way through the ship. His brother, broken on the deck. His father shattered beyond any mortal healing, conscious only long enough to whisper instructions before his body's last reserves collapsed. The war was over. The price was almost everything. The Blood Angels recovered Sanguinius's body. It was taken first to Terra, where Raldoron, Azkaelin, and 500 of the Legion's surviving warriors performed funeral rites on the throne world. Then it was carried across the stars to Baal and placed in the golden sarcophagus deep within the fortress monastery. The doors of the tomb were topped with enormous angel effigies, the architecture itself performing the act of eternal mourning that the sons of Sanguinius would continue to perform for every year that followed. The body has been there ever since, for nearly 10,000 years, and the silence it stands in is the loudest silence in the galaxy. Number Section 6. The echo that never dies, the Black Rage, and what his death cost his sons. The death of a Primarch is not simply the death of a powerful person. The Primarchs exist in a specific relationship with the warp, the psychic dimension that underlies and interpenetrates physical reality in the 40K setting that makes their dying a more complicated event than ordinary. Mortality. They are beings of enormous psychic potency, and the warp is responsive to psychic potency the way still water is responsive to a stone dropped into it. The ripples go outward. They do not stop at the edge of the pool. When a Primarch dies, especially when the death is violent and sudden and occurs at a moment of tremendous emotional and spiritual extremity, in the middle of the greatest war the Imperium had ever faced, aboard a ship saturated with chaos energy, at the hands of a brother who had been powered by all four Chaos gods simultaneously. The warp does not simply absorb the fact of the death and move on. It reverberates. The psychic death scream of Sanguinius moved through the warp along the living threads of gene seed connection that linked him to every one of his sons alive in that moment. It did not stop with the warriors who were fighting on Terra. It reached outward through the biological template itself, leaving a mark that would be carried forward in every Blood Angel subsequently created from his gene seed. In every successor chapter that inherited his biological legacy, across every generation for every year that followed. The mark was permanent. It has never healed. 10,000 years later, it is still there, still active, still claiming warriors. The Red Thirst, which had already existed as a biological reality since before the heresy, was deepened and amplified by the death. Something about the specific psychic content of Sanguinius's final moments, the grief and rage and enormous effort of a being pushing against impossible odds in the last seconds of consciousness, wrote itself into the gene seed in a way that made the existing flaw louder and harder to suppress. Warriors who had managed the Red Thirst reasonably well for decades found the margin between controlled and uncontrolled narrower than it had been. The techniques and disciplines that Blood Angel's culture had developed to manage the craving became less reliable across the board. But the Red Thirst, for all its difficulty, is manageable. Most Blood Angels manage it for most of their lives. It requires vigilance and discipline and the specific psychological tools that Blood Angel's culture has developed over 10,000 years of dealing with the same problem, but it is not automatically fatal to the warrior who carries it. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels is over 1,500 years old and still active, still serving with full capability. The sanguinary priests who administer to the chapter's spiritual and biological health have developed, over centuries, a nuanced understanding of the Red Thirst's progression and how to slow it. It is a chronic condition, difficult and painful and permanent, but livable. The Black Rage is different. The Black Rage is not livable. It is, with two extraordinary exceptions in 10,000 years of recorded history, an irreversible death sentence that happens in slow motion. The Black Rage is what happens when the psychic death imprint of Sanguinius reaches a critical saturation point in a Blood Angel's consciousness. It is not a gradual process of mental deterioration, not a slow fade of clarity replaced by confusion, not the ordinary progression of stress-related psychological damage in a being who has spent years in violence. It is a complete replacement. When the Black Rage takes a warrior, he does not simply lose his mind in any ordinary sense. He loses his identity entirely and completely, and in the space where his self used to be, the last moments of Sanguinius's life rush in and fill everything, every corner, every cognitive function. He becomes Sanguinius, not in the metaphorical sense of feeling a deep connection to the Primarch's experience. In the literal experiential sense, the warrior is convinced, absolutely and unshakably, that he is Sanguinius, that the enemies around him are the traitor forces aboard the vengeful spirit, that this moment, wherever he physically is, whatever battle he is actually fighting, is the final confrontation with Horus. He experiences everything Sanguinius experienced in those final moments: the rage, the grief, the desperate effort, the absolute refusal to stop, even when stopping is the only rational option. He fights with a physical enhancement that goes beyond what his own biology would normally provide, as if the psychic resonance of the death imprint is lending him something from the Primarch himself, a portion of the strength that Sanguinius had in those last seconds, channeled through the gene seed connection and expressing itself as enhanced speed and ferocity, and the specific quality of fighting that characterizes someone who knows exactly how much everything costs and has decided to pay it all. The Death Company. That is what Blood Angel's brothers in the Black Rage become once the chapter accepts that a warrior cannot be pulled back from the edge. Their armor is painted black, not for mourning in the conventional sense, but as an acknowledgement of where these warriors have gone and why they will not be coming back from it on their own. Red crosses mark the armor, representing the wounds of Sanguinius, as described in the visions the warriors are experiencing in real time. They are gathered together and sent into battle, into the most dangerous engagements, the assaults with the worst odds, the situations where survival for the Death Company warriors is not expected and is not the point. The chapter cannot cure them, cannot bring them back, cannot offer them anything except the warriors' end they deserve, dying in battle, surrounded by the bodies of enemies, in the act of the thing they were made to do. The alternative, the slow death in the Tower of the Lost, locked away while the Black Rage consumes what remains of their higher functions before the body finally catches up, is worse. It is worse in ways that the Blood Angels understand viscerally, and the choice to give Death Company warriors a clean death rather than containment reflects a compassion that runs very deep in Blood Angels' culture. This specific willingness to look at a terrible situation and find the version of it that is least terrible for the people experiencing it. This has been happening for 10,000 years. Every generation of Blood Angels produces new members of the Death Company. Every chapter of the Sanguinary Brotherhood, every successor, every organization that traces its gene seed back to the Angel carries the same curse in the same form, varying only in intensity and frequency. The Flesh Tearers, perhaps the most severely affected of the successors, have been fighting an ongoing demographic crisis for centuries, losing warriors to the Black Rage at a rate that their recruitment process cannot fully compensate for. They are a chapter in genuine decline, still functional, still extraordinarily capable, still fighting with everything they have, but operating with a shrinking population that the mathematics of attrition say cannot be sustained indefinitely. The Lamenters, one of the most tragic chapters in the entire setting, have been so comprehensively devastated by the combination of the Black Rage and what can only be described as catastrophically consistent battlefield misfortune that they have spent significant portions of their existence operating at a fraction of theoretical strength. Their history reads like a deliberate cruelty, as if the universe specifically chose to make an example of the chapter that was trying hardest to be kind. And the search for a cure has been going on for all 10,000 of those years, without success. Every generation of apothecaries, every sanguinary priest, every librarian who has devoted serious intellectual effort to the problem has come away without a solution. Chief Librarian Mephiston has come closer than anyone else. He survived the Black Rage through a process that remains genuinely unclear and emerged from it as something more and stranger than he had been before. But his experience has not been transferable. Whatever he did to survive the Rage, he did it in a way that cannot be systematically replicated, cannot be taught, cannot be reduced to a protocol that would help the next warrior in the same situation. The flaw is not a disease. It is not a psychological condition. It is not a biological quirk that better gene seed optimization could smooth out. It is a warp-resonant scar, a mark left by an event of sufficient psychic significance that it continues to reverberate in the gene seed, because the event that caused it, in some specific warp physics sense, still happening. The death of Sanguinius was not a single moment that concluded cleanly and then moved into the past. In the warp, where time does not operate the way it does in real space, the death of a Primarch of his magnitude is an ongoing event, a standing wound in the fabric of the psychic dimension, echoing continuously because nothing has ever provided the countervailing input that would allow it to resolve. For 10,000 years, the sons of Sanguinius have been living inside the moment of their father's death, repeating it, reliving it, dying in it, over and over again, in different bodies, on different worlds. Every single death of a Death Company warrior, a reenactment of the worst moment in the history of their line. Now sit with the implications. If Sanguinius returned genuinely, actively returned, alive and present, and generating his own signal in the warp, what would that do to the Death Echo? The Black Rage is, at its foundation, a warp-resonant imprint of a death that keeps happening because the event that generated it has not been counteracted by any subsequent event of comparable significance. The warp sustains resonances of this kind indefinitely, until something provides a countervailing input. In the case of the Black Rage, the countervailing input that would logically address the resonance is not difficult to identify in theory. The living presence of Sanguinius himself, active in the warp, generating a signal of the same frequency and amplitude as the Death Echo, but with the opposite content. Not a death, a life. Not the final moments of a being being destroyed, but the ongoing presence of a being who survived. If that input were introduced, if Sanguinius were genuinely alive and active in the warp as a conscious presence, the Death Echo would have a competing signal for the first time in 10,000 years. The Black Rage, which draws warriors into the specific experiential content of the death moment, would encounter a contradiction at the level where it operates. The being whose death they are re-experiencing is not dead. The experiential content of the Rage depends on the accuracy of its premise, and a living Sanguinius does not simply dispute that premise intellectually. He contradicts it at the psychic level where the Rage actually functions. Whether this would cure the Rage immediately and completely, whether it would affect warriors already in the full grip of the Rage, as well as those only beginning to feel its onset. These are genuine questions, without definitive answers. But the logic of cause and effect within the warp mechanics the setting has established suggests that, at minimum, the trajectory of the curse would reverse. It would stop getting worse. And over time, as the living signal of Sanguinius established itself as the dominant warp presence in this frequency, the death echo would diminish. That outcome alone, even partial, even gradual, would be transformative for the Blood Angels and every successor chapter in ways that are difficult to fully enumerate. The Death Company would shrink. The Tower of the Lost would empty, slowly. Warriors who had spent decades maintaining the rage at bay through extraordinary effort might find the effort required to be suddenly, measurably less. The whole apparatus of Blood Angels culture that has been built around managing an unmanageable loss would begin, gradually, to become less necessary. And the psychological implications of that, the slow relaxation of a grief that has been held in the body for 10,000 years, the change in what it means to be a son of Sanguinius when Sanguinius is alive rather than a death to be endlessly re-experienced, those implications are enormous and would take generations to fully work through. The Black Rage shaped everything about who the Blood Angels are. Every chapter tradition, every piece of art and architecture, every ritual and ceremony, every philosophical framework the chapter has developed to make meaning out of its situation, all of it has the Black Rage at its center. When that center changes, everything built around it changes too. Not immediately, not cleanly, but it changes. That is not a small thing. That is the rearrangement of the gravitational center around which an entire culture has been orbiting for 100 centuries. Number, Section 7. The Sanguinor, the body on bale, and the fragments of a god. Death in the Warhammer 40,000 universe is not always as clean and final as the word implies. The setting operates on the assumption that the warp is real, not metaphorically real, not a useful fictional construct for explaining certain phenomena, but actually real, a genuine dimension that parallels and interpenetrates physical space, where the accumulated psychic output of conscious beings takes on substance and form. In the warp, emotions become architecture, beliefs become geography, and beings of sufficient psychic weight leave marks that persist long after their physical forms are gone. The warp created the Chaos Gods from the emotional output of mortal species over millions of years. It sustains the Emperor's psychic presence across the entire galaxy from a single failing body on a golden chair. It contains the remnants of the Eldari pantheon and the gestating form of Yniad, a god being born in real time from the psychic resonance of Eldari death. It is a place where nothing truly powerful ever entirely disappears, because the warp does not simply erase things that were once sufficiently real. It works with them. It continues to be shaped by them. It keeps them, in some form, even when the physical world has moved on. With this understanding, consider what Sanguinius's death would have deposited in the warp. A being of Primarch-level psychic magnitude, loved by billions across 10,000 years of ongoing veneration, whose gene sons maintain a living connection to his psychic essence through the structure of their gene seed, dying in a moment of enormous emotional and spiritual intensity at the hands of the most chaos-empowered being in the galaxy. That is not something the warp would simply process and file away. That is something the warp would work with, would be reshaped by, would respond to in ways that we might not immediately recognize as response, but that have nonetheless been observable throughout every year since his death. The body on Baal is the starting point for any serious discussion of the physical dimension of this question. It rests in the golden sarcophagus within the fortress monastery of the Blood Angels, in a tomb that the entire chapter and the broader sanguinary brotherhood treat as the most sacred location in the galaxy. The golden sarcophagus is described in the lore in terms that go beyond simple burial container. It is a large, spherical structure, slightly translucent, with a golden light that emanates from within. The standard explanation for the light is bioluminescence, or some artifact of the preservation medium, or the effect of whatever active maintenance systems the sanguinary priests and techmarines maintain around it. These explanations are probably not wrong, but they are not complete. The people in the lore who interact with the sarcophagus most closely, the sanguinary priests, The successive generations of Blood Angels leadership who have made pilgrimages to the tomb consistently describe the experience of being in its presence in terms that go beyond what a well-maintained preservation system would be expected to produce. They describe feeling something, a presence, a weight, the specific quality of being in a room with something that is not simply an object, that is not simply the beautiful, preserved form of someone who used to be alive, something that is in some sense still there, in some form the language available to a space marine does not have adequate words for. Whether that is myth-making the inevitable accretion of legend around a sacred object, the human tendency to project presence onto things that are charged with enough emotional significance, or something more literal and physical, is a question the lore deliberately leaves open. In a universe where the Emperor's psychic presence sustains the Astronomicon from a dying body on a golden chair, the idea that a Primarch of comparable potency would leave no trace in the environment where his physical form was preserved stretches credibility. The warp responds to presence. The warp is shaped by the accumulated weight of what has been in contact with it. 10,000 years of Blood Angels veneration focused on a specific physical location would create, in the warp environment, around and within that location, something that is not nothing. For 10,000 years, the Blood Angels have been protecting that body with everything they have. During the devastation of Baal, when Hive Fleet Leviathan descended on the Blood Angels' home system, with enough mass to blot out the stars, the inner sanctum, where Sanguinius lies held. The outer defenses fell. The moons were stripped to bare rock. Every defender on Baal Prime was killed. The fortress monastery itself was pressed to the walls in a siege that consumed everything outside it, and yet the tomb itself remained undisturbed in the ways that mattered, whether that is extraordinary defensive effort alone, or whether the specific location carries a quality of protection that exceeds what the defender's own strength would account for, is genuinely unclear. The Tyranids, when they consume a world, are thorough. They do not stop at architectural barriers out of respect. They stop at things that cannot be moved, and sometimes they do not stop even then. The fact that the golden sarcophagus remained intact through the devastation of Baal is a detail that rewards attention. Then there is the Sanguinor, and no serious discussion of what remains of Sanguinius in the present-day setting can avoid him. The Sanguinor, also called the Exemplar of the Host, the Golden Angel, is one of the most consistently fascinating mysteries in Blood Angels lore. He appears during moments of extreme need, battles where the Blood Angels are facing total defeat, engagements where the tide has turned so decisively against them that survival looks impossible by any normal accounting. He appears as a golden-armored figure of unmistakably angelic appearance, fights with a speed and power that exceeds what any identified Space Marine has demonstrated in similar contexts, turns the battle, and then vanishes. No explanation, no trace, no satisfactory account of where he came from or where he went. The Blood Angels Chapter Council has an official position on the Sanguinor. He represents the noble aspect of their Primarch, the pure golden virtue of Sanguinius, separated from the darker elements of his nature, persisting in the warp as a manifestation of the collective will and faith of the sanguinary brotherhood. This is a theologically convenient explanation, and it may even be partially accurate. The problem with it is that partially accurate is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. The Sanguinor appears to be an independent agent, with something approaching individual motivation. He makes choices. He arrives at specific moments, with specific timing, that suggests awareness, rather than automatic response. He is not simply a psychic phenomenon that the Blood Angels generate in extremis. He demonstrates what looks, from the outside, like personal decision-making. Some scholars believe the Sanguinor is Azkaelon, the last surviving member of the original Sanguinary Guard, the elite warriors who served as Sanguinius's personal bodyguard during the Horus Heresy, who failed in their ultimate duty when the Primarch died aboard the Vengeful Spirit, and who may have subsequently undertaken something unusual in response to that failure. 10,000 years is a long time. The warp does things to beings who expose themselves to it over sufficient duration, and a warrior who chose to sustain himself through some mechanism that traded ordinary humanity for an extended form of service protection of the line of Sanguinius, as a kind of penance for the failure he could not undo might not look recognizably like the Azkaelon who started the process. After 10,000 years of it, He might look like something else entirely. He might look like a golden angel who appears when the blood angels most need him. Others believe the Sanguinor is exactly what the chapter council says, a genuine warp construct, but of more spontaneous origin than the theology implies. Not something designed or maintained deliberately, but something that emerged from the concentrated psychic output of Blood Angel's warriors in their worst moments. The warp builds things from belief and need. It built gods from the emotional output of billions of mortals over millions of years. Building a single coherent psychic entity from the desperate need of space marines at the moment of their deaths across thousands of battles over 10,000 years is, by comparison, not an enormous ask of the warp's generative capacity. There is a third possibility, which is less comfortable than either of those. The Sanguinor might be a fragment, a coherent piece of what Sanguinius was, still operating in the warp, still doing the thing it was structured to do, protecting the Blood Angels when protection is the only thing that matters, not a complete consciousness, not the full Sanguinius, with all his memories and his warmth and the 10,000 years of missing that would need to be addressed if he came back whole, just a piece. The part of him that was guardian, that was protector, that had made protecting his sons the central purpose of his existence. That piece, separated from everything else by the violence of the death and the warp's tendency to fracture complex things into their component elements, continuing to perform its function independently because that is what it was built for. If this third possibility is correct, the Sanguinor is evidence, not a mystery to be solved or a plot thread to be developed in isolation. Evidence that the death of Sanguinius was not a complete ending, that what he was did not entirely cease, that the warp shaped by 10 millennia of belief and need, and the living thread of his gene seed in millions of warriors across the galaxy, has been keeping something alive. A fragment that goes out and fights when it is needed, and comes back to wherever it rests when the fight is done, waiting for the next time, carrying out a function with a dedication that has never wavered across 10,000 years. The question that the Sanguinor raises, if you follow this logic, is what it would mean to reassemble the fragments. The Sanguinor, the guardian piece. The death echo in the Black Rage, the final moment piece, the one locked in the last seconds of the fight with Horus, unable to progress past that point. The light in the golden sarcophagus, whatever that is, whatever the physical form on Baal has become or retained across 10,000 years of preservation and veneration, and the specific quality of warp-saturated attention that has been focused on it every day of those 10,000 years. These are not separate things. They are aspects of a single thing that was broken apart by the violence of a specific death in a specific place and has been scattered ever since, each piece doing what it can with what it has, none of them complete, all of them pointing toward the same center. The center is the golden sarcophagus on Baal. The center is the body that lies in the light of its own preservation, in the silence that is the loudest silence in the galaxy. The center is the being who was Sanguinius, who died, whose death is the whole story, and who might not be as definitively ended as the word death usually implies. In the warp, things that are sufficiently real do not simply disappear. They persist, in forms that change and fragment, and sometimes reconstitute, until something provides either the final ending or the beginning of recovery. For 10,000 years, the fragments of what was Sanguinius have been circling the wound of his absence in smaller and smaller orbits, held in place by the living connection of the gene seed and the ongoing devotion of billions of believers. Something has been building. Something has been accumulating. Something is waiting for a moment when the right configuration appears, and the scattered pieces find themselves able to do what scattered pieces cannot do alone: become whole. Number. Section 8. The Precedent of Guilliman, and what it means. To understand the possibility of Sanguinius returning, you need to understand what Guilliman's return actually demonstrated, not just as a plot development, but as a structural proof of what the 40K narrative is willing to do, and what mechanisms it has established for doing it. Because Guilliman's return was not a trivial thing. It was a paradigm shift. It changed the rules of what is allowed to happen in this setting, permanently and definitively. For most of the history of Warhammer 40,000 as a narrative, the Horus heresy was a closed wound, tragic, enormous, world-defining, but finished. What it produced was fixed. The Emperor on the throne, the Primarchs gone, the legions broken into chapters, the Imperium in its grinding, failing, grimly persisting state. The characters that defined that period were historical in the same sense that figures from ancient history are historical, enormously significant, thoroughly documented, completely past. They were not coming back. The setting's identity depended in part on them not coming back, because the hopelessness of the grimdark depended on the Golden Age being genuinely unreachable. Guilliman's revival broke that understanding. It did so carefully, with substantial narrative groundwork, but it broke it definitively and permanently. The precedent is now established within the setting's own rules. A Primarch, absent for 10,000 years, preserved in a state that looked like death from the outside, can be returned to full function under the right conditions. The right conditions, in Guilliman's case, were three things working in concert. First, a body maintained at the edge of death for 10 millennia, rather than fully past it preserved in stasis, technically still alive in some minimal biological sense, the cellular machinery suspended rather than stopped. Second, a technician of extraordinary capability who had spent those 10 millennia specifically preparing for this possibility with both the biological tools and the understanding needed to bridge the gap between suspension and function. Third, an outside psychic force capable of providing the last element, the spark, the resumption of consciousness, the thing that technology alone could not supply. Belisarius Cawl provided the second element. The Eldari priestess Yvraine, empowered by the death god Yniad, provided the third. Together they produced what should have been impossible. Cawl is worth examining carefully, because his relevance to a potential Sanguinius return is not speculative. It is structurally embedded in what he is and what he has been doing. Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Cawl is approximately 10,000 years old. He has been continuously active, continuously learning, continuously working on projects that span the entirety of the post-heresy period. He was tasked by Guilliman before the Primarch entered stasis with two specific commissions: Guilliman's own potential revival and the Primaris Space Marine program. He completed both, but Cawl does not stop working when his assigned tasks are complete. He is a being of effectively infinite intellectual curiosity and effectively infinite patience, operating on timescales that make other people's long-term planning look like impulse decisions. In 10,000 years of access to the gene seed of every Space Marine Legion, Cawl has accumulated an understanding of Primarch biology that is essentially unrivaled. He studied the Blood Angels gene seed extensively enough to produce the Primaris Blood Angels, a new generation of transhuman warriors, built on an enhanced template that incorporated everything 10,000 years of understanding had made possible. To do that work properly, he needed to engage deeply with the specific characteristics and mechanisms of Sanguinius's biological legacy. He would have encountered the red thirst in that gene seed. He would have encountered the biological substrate that enables the black rage. He would have followed those pathways to their sources, because that is what Cawl does. He follows things to their sources, and the source of the Blood Angel's flaw traces back to the Primarch himself. Did that investigation lead him somewhere? Did 10,000 years of studying the most beautiful and most broken gene seed in the Adeptus Astartes produce, alongside the Primaris Marines that were delivered to the Blood Angels during the Indomitus Crusade, something else? Some tool, some understanding, some prepared biological framework that addressed not just the descendants but the source? The lore does not confirm this, but Cawl's character, as established across the most recent decades of 40K storytelling, is defined by doing work that no one asked him to do, on problems that no one identified for him, because he had the time and the capability and the intellectual momentum to take things further than his original brief required. The devastation of Baal, viewed through the lens of what it revealed about the Blood Angel's long-term vulnerability, takes on a different quality. When Hive Fleet Leviathan almost consumed Baal, when the fortress monastery was the last standing structure, on a world that was otherwise being stripped to nothing, the tomb of Sanguinius came within a catastrophic margin of being lost. The Indomitus Crusade fleet arrived in time, and Guilliman reinforced the chapter with Primaris Marines and expanded Dante's mandate as defender of the nihilist half of the Imperium. But the near miss was real, and the lesson it demonstrated was clear. The Blood Angels, in their current state, gradually declining under the weight of the black rage, cannot indefinitely defend Baal against everything the galaxy is capable of sending against it. That lesson has been noted by Guilliman, who is, if nothing else, a strategic realist, by Call, who has been observing the Blood Angels' demographic situation for 10,000 years and understands the mathematics of a chapter that is slowly bleeding out better than anyone, by Dante, who has been aware of the chapter's long-term trajectory for most of his 1,500 years of service, and who received, from a vision of Sanguinius himself, a cryptic instruction about carrying a chalice until a new golden throne is found. What does that instruction mean? Whose golden throne? When Guilliman told Dante about the broader political context, that Dante would have a larger role in the defense of Imperium Nihilus, that did not feel like the completion of the prophecy. It felt like a step, a preparation, something getting positioned for something larger. When Sanguinius told Dante he would carry the chalice until a new golden throne was found, Sanguinius was dead, speaking in a vision. Sanguinius, who is dead, giving Dante instructions that reference a future event, is either the kind of prophetic, posthumous message that the 40K setting occasionally allows for a psychic resonance of the Primarch's consciousness, echoing forward through the gene-seed connection, or it is something more direct and more unsettling, something that knows what it is saying and why, something that is telling Dante to hold on, to keep carrying what he is carrying, because the reason for putting it down is coming. Games Workshop does not insert cryptic prophecies from dead Primarchs into their narrative without intending to cash them out. The prophecy is there. The chalice is being carried. The golden throne that will make it possible to put the chalice down has not yet appeared, but something is building toward it. Number, Section 9. How could he return? The theories. We are now moving from established lore into the territory of informed theory and inference, and it is worth being precise about what that means. The theories that follow are built from actual lore elements, extrapolated with care, but they are not confirmed plot. They represent serious attempts to work out how a return that has not yet happened might function within the rules and mechanics that the setting has established. They are the conversations that fans and analysts have been having for years, and they are worth examining seriously because the best of them illuminate real things about how the 40K setting actually works and what it would or would not permit. The body preservation theory rests on the specific nature of the golden sarcophagus and what it has been doing for 10,000 years. The standard distinction that the lore makes between Sanguinius' situation and Guilliman's is that Guilliman was in stasis, preserved at the edge of death, not fully past it while Sanguinius died completely. This distinction matters enormously if it is correct. But the lore's description of the golden sarcophagus and of the Blood Angel's attitude toward the body it contains leaves genuine room for a different interpretation. Consider, the golden sarcophagus is not described as a tomb in the way the word ordinarily implies. It is described as a preservation structure with active properties. The slightly translucent material allows the form inside to be partially seen. The light from within is an ongoing phenomenon, not a historical feature. The sanguinary priests perform ongoing maintenance around it, not the maintenance of a monument, which would be architectural and cosmetic, but the maintenance of a system, which implies ongoing function that can be affected by the quality of the maintenance provided. If the golden sarcophagus is not simply containing a corpse, but actively maintaining a biological system that is suspended rather than dead, not entirely unlike the mechanisms that sustain the Emperor on the Golden Throne, albeit at a vastly smaller scale, then the question of Sanguinius' biological state is more open than the simple framing of "he died" allows for. The Emperor is, by most accounts, biologically dead in the conventional sense, his body destroyed beyond any normal healing long ago, and yet the Emperor persists, sustained by a combination of extraordinary technology and the psychic energy of 1,000,000 souls sacrificed to the Astronomicon every day. If that is possible for the Emperor, it is at least worth asking whether something analogous, at a smaller scale, might be happening with Sanguinius. Primarch biology also complicates the simple "he died" conclusion. The Primarchs are not easy to kill in the first place, and their healing capabilities are extraordinary, even by the standards of beings who are designed to resist death. The specific mechanisms by which Horus killed Sanguinius, whether the death was instantaneous and complete, or whether it was catastrophic damage followed by biological suspension of some form, the body shutting down all non-essential systems in response to damage beyond what even Primarch healing could address, is not specified in the level of detail that would definitively resolve the question. What is specified is that the body was recovered, was recognizably Sanguinius, and was placed in the golden sarcophagus in a state that has been maintained across 10 millennia. A body in that state is not obviously beyond the reach of Call's capability, given that Call demonstrated with Guilliman that the gap between apparent death and actual death can sometimes be bridged with sufficient technical understanding and a suitable psychic catalyst. The Call solution deserves its own extended examination, because Call's involvement in a Sanguinius return is not a wild extrapolation it follows from what Call is and what he has demonstrably been doing. He has had 10,000 years of access to Sanguinius's gene seed and has used it to produce the Primaris Blood Angels. He has had 10,000 years to think about the specific problem of the Blood Angel's flaw, which is rooted in the Primarch's own biology. He has demonstrated the capability of working at the Primarch level through his revival of Guilliman. And he has a track record of pursuing projects far beyond his original brief, because 10,000 years of continuous operation gives a mind like Call enormous momentum toward problems that are adjacent to the ones he was explicitly assigned. The question of whether Call has a stored framework for a Sanguinius revival, whether sitting somewhere in his facilities or in the minds of the Call inferior systems that carry distributed portions of his knowledge, there is a prepared protocol for the specific situation of a Primarch preserved in the golden sarcophagus is genuinely open. The lore has not confirmed it, but the lore has also not confirmed that Call only works on projects he has been explicitly assigned, because the entire Primaris Space Marine program demonstrates that he is capable of working far beyond any explicit mandate when he has the time and the material and the intellectual drive to pursue something important. If Call has such a framework, what would it need? The body is on Baal. The biological tools, presumably, exist in Call's systems. The missing component is the third element, the outside psychic force that provided the bridge for Guilliman, the thing that technology alone cannot supply, because the gap between biological suspension and functioning consciousness is not purely mechanical. For Guilliman, that component was Yvrain and the power of Ynid, the Aeldari death god, whose specific domain is the interface between death and continuation, whose followers, the Ynnari, represent a new force in the galaxy, specifically oriented toward breaking cycles of destruction and finding paths through endings that should not have other sides. Ynniad's power was instrumental in Guilliman's revival. The Ynnari have stated interests in building alliances with forces capable of working against Chaos's dominance. And Sanguinius, from a Ynnari theological perspective, represents something enormously significant, a soul of vast power that died at the hands of Chaos, and might be reclaimed from whatever Chaos has been doing with the remnants. Whether the same mechanism Ynnari involvement, Ynid's power would work for Sanguinius, is genuinely uncertain. The situations are not identical. Guilliman's biological preservation was cleaner, his stasis more recent in terms of the gap between damage and preservation. Sanguinius's situation involves more unknowns. But the Ynnari's explicit interest in the Blood Angels they have interacted with Blood Angels characters in the narrative suggests that the connection is alive and that the possibility is being kept open at the narrative level. The warp reconstitution theory is perhaps the most philosophically interesting of the possibilities and the most difficult to evaluate because it depends on warp mechanics that are deliberately kept somewhat vague in the lore. The core argument runs as follows. 10,000 years of intense, focused, emotionally resonant veneration of Sanguinius across billions of believers has created, in the warp, a structure of psychic substance that corresponds to the person being venerated. The warp builds things from belief. It built gods over millions of years. There is no obvious reason why 10,000 years of the specific quality of love and grief and need that the Blood Angels and their successors and the wider Imperium have directed at the memory of Sanguinius would not have built something. The Sanguinor is the most visible evidence that it has built something. Whether the Sanguinor is the entirety of what the belief structure has produced, or only the part of it that manifests in physical space under specific conditions, is genuinely unclear. But the consistent appearance of the Sanguinor, the reliability with which he shows up when the Blood Angels most need him, the specific quality of his presence as something that feels like the Primarch, without being reducible to any identified independent entity, suggests that the warp contains something coherent and substantial, rather than simply scattered residue. The question this theory raises is whether that warp structure could be reunited with the physical body on Baal, and what that reunification would require. It might need a catalyst, something like what Yvraine provided for Guilliman, an outside psychic force bridging the gap between the warp structure and the physical form. It might need a moment of sufficient collective need and psychic concentration, the Blood Angels, at the edge of annihilation, generating the same desperate signal that produces the Sanguinor, but at a scale and intensity large enough to push the process further than a single battlefield manifestation. It might need the Emperor's direct involvement, if the trajectory of the current narrative leads to a version of the Emperor capable of acting with more specificity than he currently can from the Golden Throne. Or it might need something even simpler: time. The warp structure has been building for 10,000 years. The body has been maintained for 10,000 years. The death echo has been reverberating for 10,000 years. Everything has been accumulating, pressuring, circling the wound of the absence in tighter and tighter orbits. What happens when the orbits finally converge? What happens when the pressure reaches a point where the gap between the fragments simply closes, not because anyone provided a specific mechanism, but because the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of love and grief and need finally became sufficient to move something that was always theoretically movable? The daemonic corruption possibility exists, and intellectual honesty requires it to be named. The powers of chaos have a long relationship with Sanguinius. Kabanda, in particular, has maintained an obsession with the Blood Angels that has never wavered across 10,000 years, declaring at the devastation of Baal that the right to destroy them belonged to him alone. Khorne has a specific interest in the bloodline of Sanguinius that goes beyond ordinary tactical attention: the Blood Curse, the Red Thirst, the Death Company warriors who die in the grip of a battle fury. That is, from one angle, a very cornate thing that suggests a claim has been being cultivated for a long time. The form of a beloved Primarch, worn by something that is not him, is exactly the kind of deception that chaos is capable of and has executed before. An entity wearing Sanguinius's face, carrying his voice, walking through the fortress monastery on Baal with a warmth that every blood angel in the galaxy would instinctively respond to with joy. The damage that entity could do before the deception was discovered would be almost impossible to calculate. Every chapter of the Sanguinary Brotherhood would lower their guard. The access to Blood Angels' gene seed, to the chapter's secrets, to the trust of thousands of warriors across the galaxy who would feel in their blood that their Primarch had returned. The potential for catastrophic exploitation of that access is enormous. Games Workshop is capable of telling that story. It would be a brutal story, one of the darkest in a setting that is not shy about darkness. But it would be entirely consistent with the setting's logic, and it would represent the Chaos powers completing the work that was started with Horus using love as a weapon, turning the thing that made the Blood Angels most resilient into the thing that destroyed them. The most likely answer, as with most complex questions in narrative fiction, is probably something that incorporates multiple elements rather than following any single clean theory. Call's biological preparation providing the physical foundation, the warp structure that 10,000 years of veneration has built providing the psychic content, a catalyst, a specific historical moment, a crisis large enough to provide the psychic pressure needed, providing the trigger, the Sanguinor serving as either evidence that the process is possible or the actual bridge through which it occurs, and the specific quality of desperation that the Blood Angels have maintained for 10,000 years, the desperate reaching toward a presence that should be there and is not finally finding the shape it needs to reach into. The story of how it happens, when it happens, will probably be better than any of the theories. That is the nature of good storytelling. But the theories illuminate what the story will need to address and what it will need to do justice to. The 10,000 years of suffering that preceded the return, the specific character of the person who returns, and the galaxy-shaped hole his absence has left that his presence will need to fill. Number. Section 10. What Sanguinius returning would actually change? This is the question that everything else has been building toward, and it deserves the time and space it needs, because the answer is not simple, and the parts of it that seem simple are not the most important parts. The first and most immediate change would be to the Blood Angels themselves, and specifically to the Black Rage. This is not simply the most obvious starting point, it is the most structurally significant one, because the Black Rage is the clearest example of a problem that is directly and causally tied to a specific event in a way that suggests its resolution might follow the reversal of that event. The Black Rage is a warp-resonant death echo. It is the ongoing reverberation of Sanguinius's death through the gene seed of his sons, sustained in the warp because the event that generated it has not been counteracted by any subsequent event of comparable significance. If Sanguinius were to return genuinely, actively, psychically alive, and present, the death echo would have a competing signal for the first time in 10,000 years. The being whose death the Black Rage reenacts would no longer be dead. The experiential content of the rage, the specific moments, the specific horror, the absolute conviction that Horus is killing Sanguinius right now would encounter a contradiction at the level where it operates. What that contradiction would produce is genuinely unknown, because nothing in the setting has ever provided a countervailing signal of this type before. The possibilities range from immediate and complete resolution, the Black Rage, lifting across the entire sanguinary brotherhood simultaneously, as the death echo resolves to gradual diminishment, the rage becoming weaker year by year, harder to trigger, less overwhelming when it does occur, as the living signal of the Primarch slowly overwrites the death echo to no immediate change, but a halt in the progression. The rage no longer getting worse, no longer claiming new warriors at its current rate, but the existing scars remaining until they work through at their own pace. Any of these outcomes would be transformative. The least dramatic of them, simply halting the progression, would still mean that the Blood Angels are no longer on a slow countdown toward demographic collapse. The chapter would stabilize. The successors would stabilize. The Death Company would shrink gradually, as fewer new warriors succumbed rather than growing as it currently does. The cultural and psychological weight of knowing that you are carrying a condition that will eventually consume you would lift from the shoulders of every Blood Angel in the galaxy. What does that do to Blood Angels' culture? Everything. The entire emotional and spiritual architecture of the chapter has been built around managing a loss that was total and permanent. The rituals of remembrance, the artistic traditions, the specific quality of mournful nobility that distinguishes Blood Angels' aesthetics from those of other chapters, all of it was shaped by grief. When the grief changes, when what it means to be a son of Sanguinius is no longer defined by the ongoing experience of his absence, the culture that grew around that absence will need to adapt in ways that will take generations to fully work through. There will be resistance to the change. 10,000 years of grief creates deep grooves, and the warriors who have built their identities around managing the Black Rage, the Death Company, chaplains, the sanguinary priests, the apothecaries who have devoted their lives to treating a condition that may now be resolving, will need to find new purposes, new frameworks, new ways of understanding what their roles mean in a world where the wound is healing rather than being managed. That transition will not be instantaneous and will not be entirely comfortable, but it will happen. Because the Blood Angels, for all that grief has shaped them, are not defined only by grief. They are defined by love for their Primarch, for each other, for the people they protect. And love, when the thing it has been directed toward in absence is suddenly present, does not resist. It rushes forward. It has been waiting 10,000 years for exactly this. On the scale of the Imperium's political landscape, Sanguinius's return would introduce something that Guillemin's return, for all its significance, could not provide. Guillemin is revered and respected across the Imperium as the greatest administrator and strategist the human race has produced. The Ultramarines are the most admired chapter in the Adeptus Astartes, held up as the template against which all others are measured. But admiration is not love, and respect is not the same as the specific, personal, deep emotional investment that billions of people across the Imperium have in the name and image of Sanguinius. Sanguinius is universally loved, not by everyone with the same intensity, and not without the theological complications that arise when a militaristic organization claims a figure who was not primarily defined by military virtue, but across every world that has maintained any connection to imperial culture, across every demographic, from planetary governors to factory workers to hive city underprivilege to agricultural serfs. The name of Sanguinius carries an emotional charge that no other figure in the setting matches. He is in their prayers, their folk beliefs, the stories parents tell children, the art that makes it onto the walls of spaces too humble for official imperial iconography. He is the human face that the Imperium's inhuman structure occasionally produces, and 10,000 years have not diminished the need for that face. A living Sanguinius would change the relationship between the Imperium's ordinary people and the institutions claiming to act in their name. The Imperium currently sustains itself on fear and inertia and the desperate pragmatism of people who cannot imagine an alternative. It is not loved, it is endured. The Emperor on the Golden Throne cannot change this, cannot speak, cannot acknowledge individual prayers, cannot look a person in the eyes and demonstrate that their life has value to something capable of caring about it. Sanguinius could. He always could. The specific warmth that treated every person he encountered as someone who mattered, that quality, which is the rarest and most valuable quality a person in power can possess, was intact right up to the moment of his death. If it survives the return, if 10,000 years in the warp and whatever happened to his consciousness in the course of dying and coming back have not burned it out, then what he introduces into the Imperium is not primarily a military capability or a political authority. It is a form of human presence that authority cannot generate by itself. The experience of being actually seen and cared for by something that has the power to matter to your life. That experience is politically transformative in ways that are difficult to fully anticipate. It is also dangerous in ways that are easier to anticipate. The ecclesiarchy, the vast religious institution that has built its power on the veneration of the emperor and, by extension, of Sanguinius, would have complicated feelings about a living Sanguinius who could speak for himself, who might say things that complicate the theological positions the institution has spent 10,000 years developing, who would represent a form of religious authority that is direct and immediate and personal, rather than mediated through an institutional structure. The cardinal deacons and their successors would need to adapt to a figure who does not require their interpretation, and powerful institutions rarely welcome the disintermediation of their interpretive authority without resistance. The political friction between a living Sanguinius and the established ecclesiarchy would be one of the most interesting narrative threads of any return story, and it is one that is rarely given adequate attention when people discuss what the return would mean. The military implications get most of the attention. The political and institutional implications are at least as significant and potentially more destabilizing in the short term. On the strictly military level, the addition of a Primarch who is among the deadliest warriors the galaxy has ever seen to the active order of battle of the Imperium is an obvious and enormous benefit, particularly in the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy left in psychic darkness by the Great Rift, cut off from effective central leadership and military coordination since the Rift formed. Guilliman commands the Sanctus side. The Nihilus, where Commander Dante operates with an expanded mandate, and where the Blood Angels and their successors serve as the primary Space Marine presence, needs something comparable, a Primarch's authority and capability, and the specific quality of hope that a Primarch's presence generates in the forces around them. If Sanguinius returned and chose to direct himself toward the Nihilus, which is consistent with the Blood Angels' existing role in that region, and with Dante's expanded mandate as defender of the dark half of the Imperium, the military and morale implications would be felt. Immediately, the forces of the Nihilus, fighting without the Astronomican's guidance and without the clear command structure that Guilliman provides in the Sanctus, are operating under enormous pressure with inadequate support. The arrival of a Primarch in their midst would not simply add capability. It would change the psychological reality of fighting there, would convert a war of desperate holding actions into something with a clearer direction and a more coherent purpose. The reaction of the other surviving Primarchs to Sanguinius's return would be its own entire story. Lion L. Johnson has recently awakened from his long sleep in the rock still carrying the unresolved tensions and griefs of the heresy. The Khan is somewhere in the webway. Leman Russ is pursuing some purpose in the warp related to his own long-standing mission. Vulcan, who has been wandering and rediscovering himself for decades, is out there. All of them loved Sanguinius. All of them would feel his return in ways that the return of Guilliman, who was not gone in the same sense, who was preserved in stasis rather than dead, did not produce in those of them who were aware of it. The reunion of the surviving Primarchs, centered on the return of the one they most loved and most mourned, would be the most emotionally significant gathering of extraordinary beings the setting has produced since the Great Crusade. What they could achieve together, the political alignment, the military coordination, the covering of both halves of the galaxy simultaneously, would be substantial. But even setting aside practical achievement, the personal dimension of those reunions would be, in the best possible version of this story, where the most interesting things happen. Kabanda would return. This is essentially certain, because Kabanda's obsession with Sanguinius and the Blood Angels has defined the daemon's existence for 10,000 years, and a living Sanguinius would be irresistible. The Bloodthirster, who almost consumed the Blood Angels at Cygnus Prime, who declared his exclusive right to destroy them at the devastation of Baal, who has been their most persistent and most personally motivated supernatural enemy. He would come for Sanguinius. The moment word reached the warp that the Primarch lived, that confrontation, when it came, would settle something that has been unresolved for 10,000 years. The Primarch who broke Kabanda's back at the Eternity Gate recovered, rested, no longer carrying the accumulated weight of years of continuous fighting. The outcome of that confrontation might be different from the last time they met in the moments before. Sanguinius had nothing left to give. The question of what happens to the narrative of chaos, the whole framework of inevitability and decay, and the certainty of eventual victory when Sanguinius comes back, deserves its own attention. The chaos powers, and particularly Khorne, and the specific agents of Khorne, who have been managing the long-running project of the Blood Angels' cursed decline, would not simply accept a living Sanguinius as a neutral development. They would treat it as an emergency, as an affront, as evidence that the victory they thought they had secured was not as complete as they believed. Because the death of Sanguinius was, from the Chaos perspective, one of the defining achievements of the Horus heresy. Not the fall of Horus that was complicated. The outcome was not what they had intended. The Emperor's survival was not part of the plan. But the killing of the most beloved Primarch, the one who would never have turned, the one who had the specific quality of goodness that was most threatening to the entire Chaos project, that was accomplished. The grief it caused, the black rage it created, the slow bleeding out of the sanguinary brotherhood across 10,000 years, those were ongoing returns on the investment of that single death. Sanguinius coming back cancels the returns and retroactively challenges the achievement. Chaos does not like having its achievements challenged. The response would be immediate, enormous, and personal, in a way that only entities who hold specific grievances over millennia can manage. But here is the thing. Sanguinius has been dead for 10,000 years, in whatever form the warp keeps the dead. The Chaos powers have had access to whatever fragments of him existed in that dimension for all of that time. If they were going to corrupt him, they have had the longest opportunity in the setting's history to do it. The fact that the Sanguinor, whatever the Sanguinor is, remains unambiguously on the side of the Blood Angels, consistently arriving to protect rather than to destroy, consistently aligned with the values that defined Sanguinius in life, suggests that whatever state he has been in for 10,000 years has not been successfully corrupted. The integrity has held. The question of who he comes back, as the question of what 10,000 years of death and warp existence and the accumulating weight of everything his sons went through has done to his personality and his sense of self, is the most important question of all, and the hardest to answer, because the answer will define what the return story is actually about at its deepest level. He will not come back unchanged. 10,000 years of nothing is not unchanged. The specific experience of whatever it is to be a Primarch in the warp after death, whether that is a coherent continuity of experience, a fragmented series of partial presences, a long, formless interval punctuated by the moments when the Sanguinor manifested and gave him something like active purpose, or something else entirely, that has no name in any language, the setting has established that experience will have shaped him, changed him, added something, and perhaps removed something. The being who returns will be Sanguinius, will carry the memories and the values and the specific warmth that made him who he was, but will also be something that has been through an experience no one else has been through, in conditions no one else has survived, for a duration that exceeds any frame of reference. What he does with that, how he integrates 10,000 years of absence into a return, how he makes meaning of everything his sons endured in the time he was gone, how he finds his place in a galaxy that changed enormously, while he was not there to be consulted about any of it, that is the real story. Not the war, not the politics, not the cure for the Black Rage, though that matters enormously. The story is the person. If he comes back as someone who is still capable of kneeling before broken warriors and asking to learn their names if the thing that was most essential about him survived whatever it had to survive, then what the Imperium gets is not simply a military asset or a political authority or a cure for a genetic curse. It gets something it has not had since the day he died, a being of enormous power who chooses, consistently and deliberately, to use that power in service of the people around him rather than for its own sake. A being who sees people individually and specifically and lets them know they are seen. In a universe defined by the experience of being unseen by bureaucracies that cannot acknowledge individual lives, by an emperor who cannot speak, by institutions that run on the fuel of human suffering without ever looking directly at the humans who supply it, that quality is more than politically useful. It is the most subversive thing imaginable. It is the thing that makes chaos afraid. Not the wings, not the blade, not the Primarch's combat capability, or his tactical genius, or the cure he might bring to the Black Rage. The thing that makes chaos afraid is the specific quality of being genuinely good in a universe that is supposed to be unable to sustain genuine goodness. The thing that makes chaos afraid is a being who has experienced everything the darkness can do to someone and has come back from it still warm. If that being opens his eyes in the golden sarcophagus on Baal, if the light that has been emanating from that sphere for 10,000 years suddenly resolves into something recognizable rather than simply luminous, if the sons who have been waiting through the Black Rage, through the Death Company, through the devastation, through 1,500 years of Dante carrying a chalice whose purpose he has never been able to see to the end of, if they look up and find what they have been waiting for, that moment will not simply be a narrative milestone. It will be a homecoming, and homecomings, in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, are the rarest and most precious things of all. Rarer than victory, rarer than survival, rarer than hope even, because hope can be manufactured from desperation and the refusal to stop. A homecoming requires that something thought lost forever is found. That something believed gone has not gone all the way. The angel is out there, somewhere between the body on Baal and the golden guardian who appears in battles, somewhere between the death echo that torments his sons and the warp structure that 10,000 years of love has been building, somewhere in the space between what was and what could be again. The wings will spread, the light will resolve, and on the day it does, the loudest silence in the galaxy will finally, after 10,000 years, have an answer. Thank you. From the bottom of this corner of the galaxy, thank you for walking through every step of this with me. From the dying moon, where a baby with white wings fell from the sky, all the way to the golden tomb and the question that has been hanging over it for 10,000 years. This lore carries weight, and you carried it with me tonight, and that matters. If this touched you, leave a like. It is the smallest thing, and it means everything for getting these stories to the people who need them. If you are not yet subscribed, this is the moment every single video here is made with exactly this much care, exactly this much attention to what the 40K universe is actually saying underneath all the war. There is so much more of this universe to explore together, and I would far rather do it with you alongside me than alone. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think happens when he wakes up. Tell me what you hope the story looks like when it finally gets told. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is and how you found this place, because this community is made of people exactly like you, and knowing you are out there makes the work worth doing. Until next time, rest well. Number. Supplementary section. the emotional archaeology of 10,000 years. There is a dimension of the Sanguinius return story that almost never gets the attention it deserves, and it is the most intimate one. What it would feel like to be a blood angel in the days and weeks and months after the return. Not the geopolitical analysis, not the strategic implications, not the theological crisis in the ecclesiarchy or the military reorganization of the nihilists. The personal experience, what it would mean in the body and the blood, and the specific grief-shaped spaces that 10,000 years of absence has carved in the people who carry his gene seed. Blood Angel's culture, across its entire history, has been engaged in what might be called emotional archaeology, a constant, meticulous work of sifting through the wreckage of what was lost, trying to recover and preserve every fragment of the person who was taken from them. The artworks that cover the halls of the Arx Angelicum, the rituals of the sanguinary cult that reenact moments from Sanguinius's life, the annual rites of remembrance that every chapter in the Sanguinary Brotherhood observes with a solemnity that other Space Marine chapters find sometimes bewildering and occasionally moving, the pilgrimage to the golden sarcophagus that warriors undertake at significant moments in their service before a dangerous campaign, after a significant loss, in the aftermath of a battle that revealed something important about who they are. The entire edifice of Blood Angels, spiritual and cultural life, is a sustained act of not forgetting, a 10,000-year insistence that the person they lost will not be reduced to a name on a plaque. All of that, every piece of art, every ritual, every pilgrimage, every tear shed in private by warriors who are not supposed to show weakness, every meditation on the Primarch's face that warriors undertake before battle because they want to carry something of him into the fight would change the instant the golden sarcophagus opened. Not stop, change. The archaeology would become history. The reconstruction would become recognition. The careful, painful work of preserving a memory through the medium of culture would become the different and in some ways more difficult work of encountering the actual person and measuring the reconstruction against the reality. Artworks made by people who had never seen the Primarch, working from descriptions of descriptions, would be compared by every blood angel who had ever studied them against the face that was actually there. The rituals that reenacted moments from Sanguinius's life would be performed for the first time in front of someone who had actually lived them and might have opinions about the accuracy of the reenactment. That specific awkwardness, the moment when the subject of a mythology encounters the mythology itself, is one of the most humanly real things that could happen in the 40K setting, and it would be present from the very first day. Sanguinius would walk through the halls of a fortress monastery that had been built and rebuilt in the 10,000 years since he died, and every room would contain something that was simultaneously a tribute to him and a representation of someone who does not quite exist anymore, a version of himself assembled from second-hand accounts and theological interpretation, and the best guesses of people who loved him deeply and got some things right and some things wrong. How does a person handle that? What is the correct response when you find that the people who love you have spent 10,000 years building an image of you that is sometimes beautiful, sometimes inaccurate, and always the best they could do with what they had? The human response, the warm, specific, individually attentive response that was always Sanguinius's default, would be to honor the effort, without pretending the image is the same as the person, to accept the love that built it without requiring it to be perfect, to be moved by what it represents, the dedication, the refusal to forget, the 10,000 years of trying to keep him present without being constrained by it. He would need to grieve too. The return would not be only joy. He would come back to a galaxy that had been doing terrible things to people he loved for 10,000 years. The Black Rage is the most visible evidence of this, but it is not the only one. Every campaign record, every casualty report, every name in the rolls of honor that he would not recognize because they lived and died after him, the scale of what he had missed, what his absence had cost, what had happened in the time he was not there to be part of it, is enormous. The weight of that would not be manageable in a day, or a year, or perhaps in any finite amount of time. But grief was never something Sanguinius ran from. He carried it through the Great Crusade as visions of his own death accumulated, carried it through Cygnus Prime as the thing he had hidden for so long ran unconstrained through his sons, carried it up to the last moments on the Vengeful Spirit as the cost of the choice he was making made itself fully known to him. He knew how to carry grief without being destroyed by it. He knew how to keep moving, keep caring, keep paying attention to the people around him, even with the weight of unbearable knowledge pressing against the inside of his chest. He would need that capacity again, more than he ever needed it before. What he would find, alongside the grief, is something he had never had: the testimony of what his sons became without him. Not the abstract historical record, the campaigns, the victories, the contributions to the Imperium's survival across 10,000 years of ongoing catastrophe. The specific, individual, personal testimony of warriors who had lived inside the echo of his death every day of their service and had chosen every single day to keep going anyway. The Death Company warriors who had died in every generation, giving their deaths to the service of something larger. The sanguinary priests who had spent their careers ministering to a wound they could not close. Dante, 1,500 years old, carrying a burden that was never supposed to last this long, still standing, still fighting, still refusing to put down the chalice he had been asked to carry, until the reason became clear. The measure of what his sons are is the measure of who he was. The thing they became in his absence is the record of what he taught them and what they understood from it. And what they understood and what they became is extraordinary. Not perfect, not without the specific failings and cruelties that the Black Rage and the Red Thirst and 10,000 years of pressure have created, but extraordinary in the truest sense of the word, beyond what ordinary beings could sustain, beyond what ordinary love could maintain. Extraordinary in the specific way of things that were built to last and then asked to last far longer than they were built for and lasted anyway. When Sanguinius looks at them, when he really looks, with the specific quality of attention that was always his, the attention that sees the individual person rather than the category or the title or the role, what he would see is 10,000 years of love, imperfect, grief-stained, black rage, shadowed, sometimes brutal, and sometimes wrong, but genuine and unwavering, and built from the specific thing he put in them at the beginning, the understanding that caring was worth it, that the people around you mattered, that the weight of being a protector is lighter when you are honest with yourself about why you are doing it. He put that in them. They have been carrying it for 10,000 years, and when he comes home, what he receives is the fullest possible accounting of what that investment produced. That accounting is a gift, the most specific and personal gift that anyone could bring to a being who has been, in whatever way, the dead are able to experience such things, alone for 10,000 years. The galaxy will be different when Sanguinius returns. The Blood Angels will be different. The politics and the wars and the theological structures and the military calculations will all shift in ways that will take generations to fully trace and evaluate. But before all of that, before the first strategic council meeting and the first battle and the first public appearance, before a populace that is going to need to come to terms with the fact that the angel is real and present and standing in front of them rather than on the walls of a cathedral, before all of that, there will be a moment, a specific, private, impossible moment when a father finds his children, or his children find their father. The order matters less than the finding. The finding is everything. 10,000 years of longing, compressed into a single moment of recognition. The wings that every blood angel has ever prayed to, suddenly in the room. The face that every sanguinary priest has ever tried to represent in ritual, suddenly present and looking back. The warmth that 10,000 years of art and ceremony have been trying to reconstruct from fragments, suddenly original and immediate and real. And somewhere in the genetic architecture of every blood angel alive, in the deep biological machinery that has been carrying the echo of the worst moment in their history for 10,000 years, something quiet happens. Something eases. Something that has been vibrating at a specific, terrible frequency since the moment Sanguinius died on the vengeful spirit, begins gently, imperceptibly at first, but unmistakably to stop. The death echo has an answer. The wound has a cause of recovery. The black rage has something it cannot argue with. The living, breathing, wings spread, warm-handed, names-asking presence of the person whose death it has been endlessly reenacting. He is not dead. He came back. And the 10,000 years of reliving his death, all of that specific, unbearable grief begins, slowly, to become something else. Not forgotten. Grief this old does not become forgotten, but it begins, finally, to be in the past, to be history rather than present tense experience, to be something that happened rather than something that is always happening. That is what he comes back for. That is what all of it was, for the choice on the vengeful spirit, the crack in Horus's armor, the death that bought the Emperor's victory and cost 10,000 years of his son's suffering. The point of the whole terrible arc was never the suffering. The suffering was the price. The point was always the return, always the possibility, however distant, however implausible, however dependent on conditions that might never align, that the thing the suffering pointed toward was real, that the sacrifice mattered because what it protected was worth protecting, that the Imperium of man, for all its grimness and failure and grinding horror, is still capable of producing moments of genuine beauty. A Primarch coming home to his sons. An angel, finally, landing. Number, the wider ripple. How every faction in the galaxy responds. The return of Sanguinius would not occur in a vacuum sealed off from the rest of the galaxy's factions, and one of the most interesting exercises in thinking through the implications is to walk through how each major player would respond, not just the Imperium and the Blood Angels, but every significant power in the 40K universe, because a Primarch's return is not a private event. It is a galaxy-shaking one, and the galaxy knows it. The Adeptus Custodes would be the first non-Blood Angels Imperial institution to have a formal response, and their response would be complicated. The Custodes are the Emperor's personal guard, the most elite warriors in the Imperium, and their relationship with the Primarchs is historically complex. They serve the Emperor, not the Primarchs, and while they respect the Primarchs enormously, they do not owe them the same automatic deference that ordinary Space Marines might. With Guilliman, the Custodes navigated this by recognizing him as the Lord Commander and working within that structure. With Sanguinius, the situation would be different. Sanguinius has no institutional title, no administrative role, no formal place in the current structure of imperial governance. He is a Primarch, which is to say, he is an immensely powerful being with enormous authority by virtue of what he is, but he is not the Lord Commander and does not hold any of the offices that Guilliman holds. The Custodes' response would depend enormously on what, if anything, the Emperor communicates about the return. If the Golden Throne produces some psychic signal in response to Sanguinius's revival, if the Emperor acknowledges his son's return in some way, that the Custodes can interpret that would resolve the question of the Custodes' posture almost immediately. If the throne remains silent, as it usually does, the Custodes would need to make a judgment call about how to position themselves relative to a returned Primarch who does not fit neatly into the current command structure. Given the Captain General's known pragmatism and the Custodes' deep institutional memory of what the Primarchs were and what their return would mean, the most likely response is careful, formal respect combined with a period of observation, not hostility, not immediate deference, but the measured assessment of a body that has been guarding the Emperor's interests for 10,000 years and takes that responsibility too seriously to abandon caution simply because a beloved figure has returned. The Inquisition would have its own crisis, and it would be a significant one. The Inquisition's relationship with Space Marine chapters is already delicate. The chapters have autonomy that the Inquisition sometimes finds inconvenient, and the Blood Angels specifically have the additional complication of the Black Rage and the Red Thirst, which the Inquisition has been aware of in general terms, if not always in full detail. A returned Primarch who could cure the flaw who would, by his mere presence, resolve. The most damaging genetic curse in the Adeptus Astartes would strip away one of the Inquisition's most sensitive ongoing points of leverage over the Blood Angels. That would not sit well with elements of the institution that have grown accustomed to the leverage. More broadly, a living Primarch creates a complication for the Inquisition's broader mandate to maintain the stability and purity of the Imperium, because a living Primarch represents a source of authority that is not institutional, not subject to the normal oversight structures, and backed by a personal loyalty from the Blood Angels, and potentially from much of the wider Imperium, that the Inquisition cannot easily counterbalance. The Inquisition has always been most comfortable when power is fragmented, and subject to the various checks and balances that the institution has positioned itself to monitor. Primarchs are centralized sources of authority that resist fragmentation by their very nature. The Mechanicus, led by figures like Call, would be fascinated. If Call was involved in the return, which seems likely if it happens in any form resembling the Guilliman template, the entire event would be a proof of concept for capabilities that the Mechanicus has been developing, in secret, for 10,000 years. The theological implications within the Mechanicus would be enormous. The machine, God's relationship with Primarch biology, the question of whether the Omnissiah sanctioned the revival, the specific status of a being who has been both biologically dead and psychically present in forms like the Sanguinor for 10,000 years. The tech priests would have opinions, and those opinions would not all align. The chaos powers would respond with rage. Not the unfocused rage of beings who have been surprised. The chaos gods are not easily surprised, and the possibility of Sanguinius's return has presumably been visible to their prophetic sight for some time. But the specific, motivated rage of beings who have had an achievement challenged. Khorne's response would be the most immediate and the most physical. Kabanda would be unleashed with whatever additional capability Khorne could grant, and the assault on Baal and on Sanguinius, personally, would be the first military consequence of the return. Tzeentch, whose entire aesthetic is the weaving of complex plans and the manipulation of information, would have already been moving pieces for this scenario years in advance. Nurgle would respond in the specific way. Nurgle responds to everything with patience, with the long view, noting that even a returned Primarch is mortal in the sense that matters. That entropy eventually wins every argument. Slaanesh would have the most complicated response, because Slaanesh and Sanguinius have the most complicated existing relationship. The Blood Angels' aestheticism, their specific relationship with beauty and art and the dark edge of sensation, has always been the closest of any Imperium faction to Slaaneshi territory, and a living Sanguinius navigating that territory would be simultaneously a target and a possible point of contestation. The Aeldari would have multiple responses depending on faction. The Craftworld Aeldari would recognize the significance of a Primarch's revival and would be calculating what it means for the balance of power and for the trajectory of the galaxy-wide conflict with chaos that all mortal species are in, whether they acknowledge it or not. The Wynari specifically, if they were involved in the return, would treat it as a validation of everything their theology asserts about the nature of death and the possibility of moving through it without being consumed, and would push for a deeper alliance with the Blood Angels and with Sanguinius personally on the basis of that shared experience. The Tyranids, as a faction, would register the return of Sanguinius primarily as a change in the threat assessment for any future assault on Baal. The hive mind, whatever it is and however it thinks, calculates rather than reacts emotionally, and the calculation for another assault on a world defended by a Primarch one who has just demonstrated by his return that the previous assault failed to achieve its full objective would produce a different conclusion than the calculation that led to the devastation. The Blood Angels might get a respite, or the hive mind might escalate, recognizing that the window before the Blood Angels are fully restored and at peak capability is narrow and needs to be exploited. Either way, the calculation changes. The Tau, operating in the far reaches of the galaxy and with their own specific priorities, would register the return as significant intelligence and would factor it into their long-term assessment of the Imperium's trajectory. The Tau, whose survival has often depended on the Imperium being too distracted by other threats to focus on them, would recognize that a revitalized Imperium with active Primarchs is a different adversary than the one they have been dealing with, and would adjust accordingly. And the Orcs, scattered across the galaxy in their billions, pursuing endless wars for the simple joy of fighting, they would respond the way Orcs respond to everything significant, with excited aggression. The return of a being of Primarch-level power would register in the Orc consciousness not as a theological or political event, but as an invitation. Where there is a being powerful enough to be worth fighting, there will be Orcs looking for the fight. This is not necessarily a strategic concern, The Blood Angels have been managing orc aggression for 10,000 years, but it is a predictable consequence that any campaign planning around the return would need to factor in. All of these responses, taken together, paint a picture of a galaxy that does not receive the return of a Primarch passively. It reacts in every direction at once, with the full force of every faction's specific motivations and histories and calculations. And in the center of all of that reaction stands Sanguinius, newly returned, learning the shape of a world that has changed enormously in his absence, trying to be what he always was, in conditions that are stranger and harder and more complicated than anything he faced before. He has been here before, in a sense. The Great Crusade was also an enormously complicated situation, with competing factions and impossible demands, and the constant weight of being the person everyone needed to be everything for. He navigated it then with warmth and patience and the specific quality of caring that made even his most difficult political moments feel like they were about something beyond politics. He can navigate it again. The galaxy needs what he has always been. Not the military capability, though that matters. Not the symbolic significance, though that is enormous. Not the cure for the Black Rage, though that would transform everything for his sons. The galaxy needs someone who sees people, who kneels before broken warriors and asks to learn their names, who carries terrible knowledge and does not use it as a reason to stop being present for the people around him, who chooses, every single day, to be warm in a universe that has given him every reason to be cold. That is what is coming back. That is what has been waiting in the golden sarcophagus and the death echo and the warp structure and the face of the Sanguinior for 10,000 years. That specific quality, that one simple, devastating thing. The angel is coming home. The galaxy had better be ready.